And I just started recording this webinar. We'll upload it to our YouTube channel, and folks will be able to see it then if you do need to recap or share with somebody before the applications are due. And then, so lastly from this slide, utilize intersectional approach to health equity through policy, systems, and environmental change. So eligibility criteria. So you do have to have an office located in California and be providing services in California, are registered as a 501c3 community-based organization or tribal organizations. As I mentioned before, fiscal sponsorships are eligible, and it's also open to coalitions of organizations and collaboratives as long as the backbone of the organization is an eligible applicant. County behavioral health organizations that are the sole provider of prevention services in their respective counties are also eligible. You cannot have an active Elevate Youth California grant, and you must have experience partnering with young people of color and other marginalized communities, again, disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. Grantees should have a history of working with these communities, including representation of these communities on the board and staff and clients served and neighborhoods served as well. So the scope of work, the activities supported by this funding must be related to preventing youth substance use disorder through a policy, systems, or environmental change approach. It must be focused on the following 3 outcomes. 1, investment in youth empowerment, leadership, and development. Program implementation through the cultural lens of the impacted community, and population level impacts through policy, systems, and environmental change. So kind of same thing, getting at folks that are reflective of the communities they're serving, and specifically communities impacted by the war on drugs. So again, this grant is due August 28th by 1 p.m. Feel free to reach out to us if you are planning to work on this grant, and we can be of whatever help that we actually can offer. So next, this is the one I mentioned that's coming out of the Governor's Office of Business and Economics, also referred to as GoBiz, and it's called the Community Reinvestment Grants Program. So again, coming out of GoBiz, this grant has $48 million annually to offer to community-based organizations and local health departments. So they focus on human services in communities impacted by the war on drugs. If we're not noticing a pattern here, that's who these folks are kind of looking for, which, kind of only makes sense with these cannabis revenues. So local health departments and community-based nonprofits that are provide the following services can apply. So job placement, mental health treatment, substance use disorder treatment, system navigation services, legal services to address barriers to re-entry, and linkages to medical care. So eligibility for this one. Again, folks that are serving communities that were impacted by the war on drugs. We're really driving that home. They use a county with a per capita drug-related arrest rate that is higher than the state's per capita drug-related arrest rate. In addition, they also may use high unemployment and poverty, high one-parent or non-family households, and low educational attainment. GoBiz uses an interactive mapping tool to identify whether or not your organization address was in the referenced census geography. And I believe you can go on their website and you can put in like your zip code or something to kind of get a sense of how they're going about this. So the phase 2 application process is a bit more lengthy That's kind of where you get into more of that typical RFA questions and things of that nature. But phase one, again, we have spoke with the folks that do oversee this grant. Phase one is rather brief, and it is just trying to determine that your nonprofit or organization demonstrates that it's up to date with the IRS, Franchise Tax Board, Attorney General, and Registry of Charitable Trusts, and the Secretary of State. From what we understood, a lot of folks were getting rejected in the first phase because they weren't up to date with these technicalities. So that's really what phase one is all about, is it's kind of just like a secondary measure of making sure that you're eligible for these funds. And in order to do that, you do kind of have to have all your taxes and paperwork up to date. So again, GoBiz has $48 million to award. So this is a super huge grant opportunity. I'll get to it, but they're giving out up to $3 million. So this is a really great opportunity. Something that is pretty great about this is that they do allocate 50% of funds to organizations that have revenue of 5 million or less. And these funds are to be expended over 3 years. In the past, that number was 2 million. It has went up a bit. So hopefully folks still kind of are able to make use of that. If you are a smaller organization with, I believe an operating budget of less than $5 million, 50%. So half of these funds are going to be prioritizing folks with less than $5 million budgets. So that is pretty great that some of our smaller organizations will get that kind of attention. So for this application, phase one, which is again, those technicalities, making sure you're up to date and in good standing, is due September 18th, 4:59 p.m. Pacific time. So funding amounts are as followed. For a single applicant, you can request a minimum of $600,000 and a maximum of $3 million. That has went up quite substantially from when this grant first came about. So that is honestly pretty awesome. And this year, they're not accepting collaborative applications. That was something that took place in the past. We might have to kind of conversate with them to understand why they went with that this year. But this year, they're not accepting collaborative applications. So just keep that in mind, that it's only for single applicants this fiscal year. And again, September 18th at 4:59, I'll go ahead and send this, I'll send potentially the webinar, but definitely the webinar recording, but I'll definitely send this PowerPoint slide out to everyone who has attended after this webinar is over. That way you guys just have access to this information, and these are clickable links here, so you can just go directly to the website and kind of read through and get more information, more details. And yeah, Jim will be taking away the next part, talking about, again, redirecting local cannabis tax revenues.
Great, thank you, Ajua.
Of course.
We should just take a breather before we jump into this next topic and see if there's any questions in the chat. I wanted to lift up a couple of things that have changed in these grant programs that Ajua mentioned, but just to highlight them. One is that Elevate Youth California now will accept applications from county behavioral health agencies, with the caveat that those agencies have to be the primary prevention provider in the county. And then, as Ajua mentioned, in the past, the GoBiz grant program, the Community Reinvestment Grant Program, did accept applications from collaboratives and awarded larger grants to collaboratives. And this time they're only accepting from a single applicant, but for a larger amount. We are happy to have a conversation with you if you're going to be applying and sharing any other kind of input, advice we might be able to offer you. I know I see in the chat people asking about giving advice on proposals. Yeah, I'm not sure if, I think we'd be happy to have a conversation with you about that. So feel free to reach out after the webinar and we can share any insights we've been picking up over the years working on this. Neither Ajwa or I have been involved in reviewing applications for Elevate or for GoBiz. I have been involved in reviewing applications for the Prop 64 program that is managed by the Board of State and Community Corrections, which is a whole nother conversation. And Ajwa has been a reviewer for the California Natural Resources Agency Prop 64 grant program, which is also a youth-focused grant program. And we'll do outreach to everyone when CNRA, the Natural Resources Agency, comes out with a new application. But we haven't been involved at the proposal review level with GoBiz or with Elevate. I serve on the DHCS Prop 64 Advisory Commission. So I get, I'm in a, we meet quarterly or 6 times a year or something like that. So I am kind of always seeing the big picture, but not probably at that level of detail. Okay. All right, well, let me go ahead and get into our next topic here. So we wanted to flag for you that across California, cities and counties that have legal cannabis businesses, the vast majority of those are collecting their own tax revenue from cannabis. So Prop 64 had language in there about how the state taxes cannabis and what the state does with state revenue. But it was basically silent on what local governments can and can't do. So many local governments have put together ballot measures to create their own tax on cannabis and are collecting revenue from that tax. So using the city of Sacramento as an example, we've had a tax in place on cannabis for several years now, and the city collects about $23 million off of it. And what we're trying to encourage people on the ground in your local cities where this is going on is for you also to be advocating with your city council or with your county board of supervisors and urging your local governments to reinvest those dollars in communities impacted by the war on drugs and kids services, and not have those dollars just go into the local government's general fund. And we've been publishing some reports on that. We're going to share a little information on a report we did recently for Los Angeles County and the cities in LA that are collecting revenue. But we're happy to work with anybody on the ground in the state and any local city or county who wants to look into this. In the long run, my view is that local cities and the counties will be collecting more revenue from cannabis than the state does, and that it is a long-term funding stream that we need to get our heads around. I want to just mention one other thing about local governments. Local governments also have the ability to regulate the cannabis industry. So local governments can regulate, for example, cannabis advertising. And Ajwa and I do a bunch of work on trying to regulate cannabis advertising that's targeted at children and youth and uses images and language that is attractive to youth. We're also very concerned about the levels of THC in cannabis products and the impact of those high levels of THC on mental health. So unlike the era of tobacco, many of us worked on tobacco in the past when local governments had some constraints. A local government couldn't tax cigarettes, for example, in the past, today or in the past. And there were limits on what local governments could do with tobacco regulation. Prop 64 pretty much gave local governments authority to tax, to regulate, et cetera. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so as you can see here, there's a number of cities that are doing some work on this already. Here in the city of Sacramento, our organization, Youth Forward, and many other youth serving organizations came together to work on a ballot measure last year, which we won, and which was called Measure L. And that measure requires the city of Sacramento to spend 40% of its cannabis tax revenue on kids and to create a children's fund. So that's requires our city to spend about an additional between $8 and $10 million on children's services every year. And like many cities prior to our winning that measure, all of that cannabis revenue was just going into our general fund. And as you know, the police department makes up the biggest part of any city general fund. And so a lot of that money was going to fund law enforcement. And we, of course, would rather see some or all of those dollars go towards prevention. Oakland's also had an effort underway called the Emerald New Deal. Santa Cruz passed a measure somewhat similar to ours before we did that requires some cannabis revenue to go to early childhood services. There are folks in Fresno that we're working with that are working on this through a measure that was passed called Measure A. And then in LA, there was an effort 2 years ago called the LA Equity Fund. You know, the city of Los Angeles is collecting quite a bit of revenue, well over $100 million a year from cannabis. And there are folks in LA wanting to redirect those dollars. And we're very supportive of that effort and would be happy to be of support to anyone on the webinar wanting to work on that. Okay, next slide. So this is the report we released a few months ago about LA. These are all the cities in LA that are collecting cannabis tax revenue. We focused on the ones that are highlighted in green. The reason why we focused on the ones highlighted in green is our budget research partners at Catalyst, California, looked at the budgets of these cities, and not all of the cities have clear information in their budget docs about how much money they're collecting and where it's going. So we couldn't really report on that, but these 9 cities did. So that's where we focused the report. Next slide. And this is one of the graphs from the city of Los Angeles budget. So similar to other cities, the city of LA spends 40% of its overall general fund budget on police. And we, of course, are making the argument that some of those dollars should be redirected, or all of those dollars, to community reinvestment into kids. Next slide. I should mention the person who did our partner on this report from Catalyst, California was Mai King, and she did a terrific job of analyzing these city budgets. And unfortunately, she found that many cities have marginal information about how much money they're collecting, what they're doing with it. So one kind of easy task, I think, for anybody, any group that wants to engage on this, is to approach your city council and get the council and the city staff to be clear about what's going on with revenue. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so these are kind of the general recommendations that we lifted up in the report for LA policymakers and for community groups to advocate around. One is incorporating some form of participatory budgeting in the distribution of cannabis funds. How does a city take input on this from particularly communities impacted by the war on drugs, Black and brown communities, and not just treat this revenue like it has no history. You know, I'm sure everyone on the call is painfully aware of the big role that marijuana played in the war on drugs, and thousands of people in California who went to prison for something as simple as marijuana possession in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, even into the even into the 2000s. And so, cannabis is not like, it shouldn't be treated like it's the city's making revenue off of granola bars. It has a racialized history. And then improving cannabis revenue transparency and accountability. And then finally, investing cannabis revenue in community programs and youth services for those most impacted. And on point number 3 here, one thought I've had is, it's hard to move money within a city budget because you're always taking money from somebody, and whoever you're taking money from is going to fight and oppose the move, of course. But another approach that may have less opposition, might be a way to get started, would be to ask your city to dedicate growth in revenue to reinvestment and kids services prevention, so that you are not effectively moving money that's already going to fund something in a city, but that as cannabis revenue grows, that those dollars get set aside for community reinvestment, kids, et cetera. So that might be, I mean, we kind of went straight at it with a ballot measure, and but there are probably a lot of other ways to do it. And certainly, I think ways to approach this that are less labor intensive and require, less people power than running your own ballot measure campaign, which we did through Sec Kids First. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so this is our contact information, and we can go ahead and continue to take questions. I'm also going to put the Youth Forward website in the chat, because I put our YouTube channel, but let me go ahead and put the link directly to the LA report, so folks who are with us and who are in LA can click and get to the report directly and not have to cruise around on our website. So let me just put that in the chat. There was a question in the chat about how many organizations are they planning on awarding. I think that is, we wouldn't know the answer to that. I think it probably depends on how many apply and then what the grant amounts are. Because surprisingly enough, when you look at the applications, many organizations apply for less than the total amount that they could apply for. So, yeah. Susanna has a question about if you have to apply annually, and the answer is no. If you're applied and awarded a grant, you have a period of time. I think for both programs, it's 3 years in which you can spend the revenue. And I should say that I believe both GoBiz and Elevate Youth California have awarded grants to organizations that had already received a grant, had completed their programming with the funds, spent out the money, applied again, and then were awarded a second grant. And we are very happy to see that pattern, because obviously this kind of work takes time to grow and develop. And I could see where there's a downside to that as well in terms of competition, but in terms of getting work done at the community level, 3 years is not a lot of time. So this in the chat. Audra, anything else you want to lift up? I just put the cannabis report in the chat.
Yeah, I see a few questions. So I'll start with the first one that I saw. It says, could you speak more about the criteria for county behavioral health to apply? Will they potentially be pulling back on community contracts so they can be primary? By they, are you meaning county behavioral health? Will they become like the primary recipients? I don't see that happening, but I can't say for certainty. But if that's how the question is reading, I don't think that they'll become like the primary recipients of who this grant is meant to go to. And as for the criteria, there's not a ton mentioned in the RFA. This is, as Jim mentioned, this is the first time we've been following this grant for a while, kind of reporting out about it. This is the first time county behavioral health orgs are able to apply. So I looked through the RFA, just kind of scanned through it. I didn't see any additional information that was specific. So I imagine that
I can weigh in on that a little bit, Ajua.
Okay, go ahead.
So this question of county agencies being able to apply directly for Elevate Youth California dollars has been a topic of conversation on the advisory commission at DHCS for the last few meetings. And I believe that DHCS is limiting the county agencies that can apply to only like most likely agencies in rural areas where there is not much nonprofit infrastructure. And in my role on the commission, I raised a lot of concerns about this. One of my concerns was that the state would award a grant to a county agency, and then that county agency would subcontract with nonprofits on the ground. And in that case, you would have the county agency taking money off the top for admin, and then sending the money to nonprofits who would also take some money off the top for admin. And obviously, in my view, that's not the best use of money. And when we began working with DHCS, we advocated that DHCS should make grants directly to nonprofits to avoid that kind of double admin take that goes on frequently with state contracts. So I do expect this will be limited, and I'm going to continue to advocate that we, that this not end up in that county, what we see going on. So, yeah, and then Monique had a question about the capacity building grants at Elevate. So Elevate does do 3 RFAs a year. They have been. One is the standard track. The next one they're doing is a capacity building one that will come out early next year if they follow the pattern from last year. And that capacity building track is for smaller organizations. And then last year they did an innovation track, which to me looked a lot like the standard track. But I expect there will definitely be a capacity building track next year. That would be my expectation.
And all of this is on the website. You can see who's been awarded. I believe it even like sometimes will list a little bit about the programs that the funds went to support. So I see that, if you're not eligible for this one, I would definitely take a closer look at that one so that early next year you can just be prepared to apply.
Yeah, I guess another point just to lift up is that with the GoBiz Community Reinvestment Grants Program, unfortunately, tribes are not able to apply directly for that grant program. And that's due to language that was written into Prop 64. A nonprofit that works with tribal communities could apply, but a tribe itself cannot apply. And when we began working with DHCS back in 2018, one of the recommendations we brought forward was that tribes and tribal organizations should be able to apply directly. And fortunately, DHCS took that recommendation. It was also lifted up by Terry Supahan from True North Organizing and a member of the Karuk tribe who participated in those early meetings with us with DHCS. So in 2028, the legislature has the ability to make changes to these programs. So the way Prop 64 was written, that made it very difficult to make changes to these grant programs until 2028. But at that point, there will be opportunity, probably both good and bad, to address some of these, to fix some of the issues in these grant programs. And to certainly with the Board of State and Community Corrections grant program, which is a whole nother topic, but we're keeping our eye on that, and we'll start doing some organizing and advocacy around that probably in 2026, 2027. So.
If there's no further questions, I'll just lift up again. We are currently doing organizing work around redirecting those local cannabis tax revenues. If that is something that you're interested, you can definitely feel free to use my email or Jim's. Reach out to us and let us know. We can help you start getting, just getting in touch with your local elected leaders and kind of, give you even a further in-depth overview of how we were able to redirect some of our local cannabis tax revenues here in Sacramento. to fund things like this, because, you know, ultimately folks doing the work in their community are always going to be in need of funding. And, you know, rather than continuing to use this money to fund enforcement, we can be using this money to fund folks that are also addressing some of the same things, but in a different way. So if that is something that interests you, again, please feel free to reach out to us and just let us know you want some more information, and we can set up, you know, personal one-on-one meetings and go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Ajwa. Just to do one more plug on that. For example, like Pomona, which is a mid or smaller city in LA County. City of Pomona anticipates they're going to collect $3.4 million this year from cannabis revenue. What if the city of Pomona put $1 million of that every year into youth services in Black and brown communities with a focus on prevention year after year? You know, that would be pretty cool. So just by way of example. Yeah. And we can look at city budgets anywhere in the state and tell you what's going on.
So I think that about wraps it up. Thank you all so much for joining. We appreciate your time and hope that this webinar has been helpful for you. Again, I will be sending out this PowerPoint as well as sharing the recording. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.